Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome back to my YouTube channel. This video is about a deeply chilling and unsettling criminal case that took place in California during the final years of the 20th century. Today we're going to look at the story of Colleen Stan. The script for this video is mostly based on the autobiography written by the victim herself, so we're getting the facts straight from the person who lived through it. I also read the book by Christine McGuire and Carla Norton. It's called Perfect Victim. So this script is also based on that book. Up there on the screen, you can see the rest of my cases. Down here are my social media accounts in case you want to follow me on any of them. And without further ado, let's get started. Colleen J. Stan, born with the last name Lashley, was born on December 31st, 1956, in California, United States. Despite coming from a Christian family and being a believer in God, Colleen's parents were divorced, which was still uncommon at that time. She grew up with her mother, her two sisters, and her stepfather, and frequently visited her father. On December 12th, 1973, she married Tom Stan. He was a 22-year-old man at the time, while she was only 16, about to turn 17. Just to have the ceremony, they even had to get her father's approval. Beyond that detail, they moved in together, and from there, things only got worse. The marriage didn't last very long. Her mother owned a boarding house in California, and that's where she met Alice and Bobby, a couple from Oklahoma who she became really close to. In 1977, she decided to move with them to the city of Eugene, Oregon, leaving her husband behind. She didn't legally divorce him, she just decided to leave. At just 20 years old, Colleen was a stubborn, impulsive young woman who was unsure about what she wanted for her future. A young woman who only cared about the here and now. I'm not the one saying this, she says it herself in her biography, co-written with Jim Green. Colleen describes herself with those words. On the morning of May 19, 1977, Colleen decided to travel to Westwood, California to surprise her friend Linda Smith for her birthday. During that trip, she would also visit her friend Sarah and her sister-in-law Sandra. Even though it was a bad idea to go alone, and several people warned her not to do it, Colleen had already made up her mind to go. That day, she said goodbye to her boyfriend, promising him she'd be back in Oregon on Sunday for a party with his parents, and then headed to her apartment to pack her backpack. Colleen had a car that was in really bad shape and didn't have money for a bus ticket, so she decided to hitchhike. She already had experience with this, since Colleen had hitchhiked before with Bobby and Alice. This wasn't her first time, and she knew exactly how to do it safely. In fact, she actually met her boyfriend at the time while hitchhiking through the forests of Oregon. In the end, it was Alice who gave her a ride to Interstate 5, where her journey and the road to her torment began. Colleen arrived at Interstate 5 at 7 in the morning, and she had almost 8 hours of travel ahead of her to get to Westwood. First, she traveled 27 kilometers with a college student to Cottage Grove. Once there, she got out of the car and got into a truck that was transporting boxes of juice, which took her all the way to Red Bluff. The truck was driven by two men, and one of them made inappropriate advances toward Colleen. He tricked her into hiding during a police checkpoint so he could touch her and try to kiss her. However, Colleen refused to be intimidated by that experience, which maybe should have been the first big warning sign not to continue the trip. But by that point, she had already traveled 500 kilometers out of the 650 that separated Eugene from Westwood. So she decided to keep going. Once in Red Bluff, at the intersection of Interstate 5 and Highway 36, Colleen decided to wait for the next car she would hitch a ride with. She let two vehicles that had offered her a ride pass by. She decided to be more cautious because of the incident with the truck driver and not to travel alone with men. Finally, a blue two-door Dodge Colt stopped next to Colleen. Her passengers were Cameron Hooker, a young man just 4 years older than Colleen, who was traveling with his wife Janice and their baby. Obviously, they seemed like very trustworthy people from the outside, a happy family, a family traveling together who just wanted to give her a ride. With this context, now we move on to the day of the events. She trusted that it was just that, a family with their baby. So Colleen decided to get into the Hooker's car, and they offered to take her to Westwood. They drove for about 4 kilometers until they decided to stop at a gas station in Pines Creek, where Colleen says that while she was in the bathroom, a voice in her head told her to jump out the bathroom window and run away. But she ignored this intuition and went back to the Hooker's car. When she sat in the back seat, Colleen saw that there was a strange wooden box next to her, which hadn't been there before. That was the last big sign that she should run, but she didn't. I'm going to make a quick side note before continuing, and I want to say that sometimes intuition, that little voice in your head telling you maybe you shouldn't go with these people, is often really your brain picking up on strange behaviors without you realizing it. And Colleen should have listened to that intuition, but again, they seemed like a normal family. Once they were back on the road, near Lassen Volcanic National Park, the Hookers asked Colleen if she minded stopping for a moment in the park to see the ice caves. Colleen told them it was no problem. Cameron Hooker then turned right and drove down a dirt road into the woods until they reached a creek. The Hookers got out of the car, but Colleen stayed inside to wait. That's when it all began. But instead of telling you, I'm gonna read you what she wrote. I looked out the window and could see the woman and the baby by the creek, but the man was nowhere in sight. For just a second, I had lost track of him. Suddenly, the seat in front of me was shoved forward, and the man jumped into the back seat with me. A large, sharp butcher knife was in his hand, pressed against my throat. "Put your hands on your head," he ordered. I froze in fear. All I could think was, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening to me. I was petrified and couldn't move. My mind was completely paralyzed by shock as adrenaline started surging and coursing through my veins. "Put your hands on your head," he commanded once more, pressing the knife harder against my throat. I did what he told me. I unconsciously realized that we were both shaking. I was shaken with fear, while he was probably shaken from nerves. A pair of handcuffs came out of his backpack and passed before my eyes. Quickly, one wrist and then the other were cuffed behind my back. Now I was a captive with no way to escape. I was afraid this was the beginning of the end for me. I was gonna die. The man picked up the knife and pressed it against my throat again. "Are you gonna do what I tell you?" I was petrified and couldn't speak, so all I could do was nod my head. Then he secured a cloth blindfold over my eyes. He put something over my head and face that fit like a harness. A wide leather strap covered my mouth and wrapped around my head. Another strap went under my jaw. 2 additional straps went up the sides of my nose and joined at my forehead. From my forehead, the strap continued over the top of my head and was secured to the wide strap at the back of my head. Now my jaw was securely locked in place, keeping me from opening my mouth to scream. Finally, he tied my ankles together with a rope. The speed and precision of his movements showed that the man was well rehearsed. This wasn't an ad hoc kidnapping. Instead, the man had set up the restraints in his car ahead of time. I thought about the situation and realized that the couple had been hunting for prey, and I was their catch. My mind was still in shock. I couldn't believe what was happening to me. Without me knowing it, the worst was still yet to come. Now, the purpose of the strange box on the back seat next to me became clear. The 20-pound box worked like a trap, with a round hole designed to fit around my neck. With the box open, half of the semicircle was on the lid, while the other half was on the base of the box. 2 latches secured the main box, preventing light sounds and fresh air from getting in. The human head contains 4 of the 5 senses. Inside the box, my vision, hearing, taste, and smell were suppressed and eliminated. My vision was darkness, sound was muffled, the taste was that of a leather gag, and the smell was of foam and carpet. My sense of touch was not affected by the head box. I could feel the suffocating device on my head, the handcuffs on my wrists, and the rope on my ankles. Since the woman didn't say anything, I concluded that she knew about the plot to kidnap me beforehand. For some unknown reason, she placed the baby on top of the sleeping bag that was covering me. When the baby started crying, she took it back. I could feel the car moving along the dirt road and turning right onto the highway. We headed west, back over the mountain, toward Red Bluff. Since I couldn't hear the man or the woman talking, I assumed they were driving in silence. Even as they had spoken, I'm not sure I would have been able to hear them. We kept driving until the car made a series of sharp turns and suddenly stopped. The engine was turned off, the man got out this time, and the woman and the baby stayed with me in the car. After a minute or two, the man came back, and it sounded like the woman with the baby, I guess, got out and walked away. Now I was alone with the man. He sat in the back seat with me and opened the main box. "Sit down," he ordered in a stern voice. "Are you gonna do what I tell you?" "Yes," I replied, my teeth clenched behind the gag. My ankles were untied, but the gag, the blindfold, and my hands remained bound. "Get out of the car," he ordered once he was out of the car. He grabbed me by the shoulders from behind and guided me forward. That's how Colleen was kidnapped and taken to the Hooker's house, where they brought her down to the basement. From this point in the video on, I'm going to ask for your discretion regarding what I'm about to describe. Be aware that this is where the most disturbing and graphic part of the case begins, so if you want to skip it, I'll leave the timestamps here on the screen or down below on the timeline. You can check them out. Once in the basement, they stripped her and hung her from the ceiling by her wrists. Then, the Hookers proceeded to have sex in front of her, while Cameron Hooker whipped her with a whip. This marked the beginning of long months of torture, during which Colleen spent almost every hour of the day tied up in the basement with her head inside that sensory box. Once a day, around 8 p.m., Cameron Hooker would go down to the basement to torture her in different ways. He usually hung her from the ceiling by her wrists, but he also whipped and groped her. Once, he tried to electrocute her, but was unsuccessful. Underneath her, Colleen had a support that Hooker would sometimes remove to watch her kick in the air, hanging only by her wrists. After the hanging torture, Hooker would put her inside the box, which also had a specially designed compartment for her head. Even though, because of the way it was positioned, she didn't have to support its weight with her body, it still hurt to have it on, mostly because she couldn't breathe. After complaining for hours inside this box, Hooker asked her what was wrong. And when she asked him to let her get some air, he locked her up again and, using an object she couldn't identify, made it even tighter, so that her ribs couldn't expand, and it made it even harder for her to breathe. With all this going on, you might be wondering, who is Cameron Hooker? Cameron Hooker was born in Alturas, California on November 5th, 1953. His parents had moved from Arkansas in search of a better life. Harold and Lorena Hooker were simple people, a lower-class family that barely had enough to eat. As Cameron was growing up, they moved every 2 or 3 years. His father looked for work in construction or sawmills, something he would later imitate in his adult life, and his mother usually stayed home to take care of him and his younger brother Dexter. Although Cameron Hooker and his brother lived relatively good lives and were cared for by their parents, what affected them most at that time was having to move constantly. Hooker was initially described as a cheerful and quiet child, but sometimes also very friendly. He was the kind of kid who joked around with his classmates, wanting to make them laugh. His sociable side seems to have completely changed, however, when the Hooker family bought a property south of Red Bluff in 1969 and finally set their mobile home at a permanent address. At his new school, after hitting his growth spurt, Hooker started getting bullied and pushed aside because he wasn't conventionally attractive or didn't dress fashionably. During this time, he didn't have a group of friends or take part in extracurricular activities. What he did do was attend shop class, using tools and machines to build things. In everything else, he really didn't stand out much. By that time, Hooker had started to fantasize. He especially wanted to have complete control over another person. He wanted someone to be afraid of him. This fixation kept growing stronger and stronger, adding everything he learned from pornography. He sought brutality, possession, and the use of specific objects to torture his sexual victims. Of course, he was still far from actually doing anything like that at the time. When he graduated from high school in '72, Cameron Hooker started working at the local sawmill, Diamond Lands Corporation. His attitude didn't change, though. He was still a quiet man and, to the women around him, not very attractive. But while this was happening on the outside, in Hooker's mind, he was still the dominant man over a bunch of women who were punished in his fantasies. He had started planning to make his fantasies a reality. In 1973, a mutual friend introduced him to Janice, a naive and insecure young woman with curly brown hair, glasses, and an immature demeanor. After all, she was only 15 years old. Since she was much younger than Hooker, he didn't find her threatening. And while other people saw him as a man who didn't have much to offer, to Janice, he seemed irresistible. Especially because at school, the other boys treated her badly. No one had ever been as kind to her as this new person she had just met. So they started going out together and doing couple things. They had several things in common, but mainly that that they had a lot of friends and didn't really stand out, but also that neither of them was originally from Red Bluff. Janice's family had moved from the San Jose area a few years earlier. They had settled in a tiny house, not far from the Hookers, with a vegetable garden and not much else. Just like Hooker, Janice lived in a rural environment and grew up in a family that didn't put much emphasis on education and never had much money. Janice was the youngest of 4 children and doesn't remember her parents as warm or affectionate. Her father worked too much and didn't pay much attention to her. He was hardly ever home. Nor did her mother, whom she describes as a strict and critical woman. Janice was mainly looked after by her older sister, Lisa. Lisa took care of her and taught her how to sew, but Janice says she also harbored feelings of jealousy and resentment toward her older sister. She felt like Lisa was always the favorite. Janice craved attention. When she was still quite young, Janice had an epileptic seizure and connected it to her parents' lack of attention. She thought her father believed that people with epilepsy were possessed by demons, so she had to stay away from them. Whatever the reason, Janice remembers feeling rejected. She remembered being called stupid, but was rarely told she was loved. These experiences shaped her into a submissive and insecure person. Her early relationships with boys were marked by a fear of rejection. That's why, just a few months after starting her relationship with Hooker, when he suggested something unusual, she didn't hesitate as much as someone else might have. What Hooker proposed was that he wanted to hang her, suspend her by her wrist from a tree, and with no clothes on. He, of course, lied to her. He told her that his other girlfriends had let him do this, that a lot of people did it. And of course, Janice, who was terribly afraid of rejection, thought that if she didn't do this or anything else he asked, he would leave her. So she said yes. Hooker took her to the nearby mountains, tied her up with his handmade leather cuffs, and hung her up. Janice was scared. The leather cuffs were cutting into her wrists. The pain ran down her arms and back. But Hooker was so affectionate and happy when he took her down from the tree that it was easier for her to agree the next time he wanted to do the same thing. These trips to the woods became regular events. 2 or 3 times a month, he would take Janice to the forests of Tehama County to experiment. Cameron would tie her up, stake her to the ground or to tree branches. She didn't like it hurt, it was uncomfortable, but she just put up with it because once it was over, Hooker would become very affectionate and happy. It seemed like the temporary pain was worth it. Soon he started using whips and hit her. Not hard enough to leave permanent marks. He was careful about that, only welts. She didn't think Hooker would really hurt her, and he seemed to know what he was doing. So when he wanted to tie her up and dunk her in the creek, she agreed. It was a horrible experience, a brush with death by drowning that Janice would never forget. Still, she was too scared to tell her parents, too afraid to tell anyone else what was happening, especially them, since they didn't even seem to care about other things in her life. The sex, the whippings, the photos he took of her. She knew it wasn't right. Telling them all of this could get her punished and forced to leave Hooker for good. And Janice didn't want that. No matter how much he tortured her at times, he was still the kindest boy she had ever met in her life. He was also the person who had given her the most attention so far, and she clearly didn't want to lose him or the sense of security he gave her. Aside from those times when he sexually tortured her to fulfill his fantasies, the rest of the relationship was pretty normal. Since Hooker was older than her, he showed her places she had never seen before, things she had never done. This only reinforced the dependence Janice had on him. After being together for over a year, Janice decided to do something so Hooker wouldn't lose interest in her, so she told him she was pregnant and that they needed to get engaged. Of course, the whole pregnancy thing was a lie. Just imagine the impression Hooker made on Janice's family. They let her get married at 16, while her older sister had to wait until she was of legal age. Janice's parents were excited about this marriage. Or rather, as she saw it, her parents just wanted to get rid of her, so they gave Hooker permission to take her away, and even gave them $500 as a wedding gift so they wouldn't come back for a while. So on January 18th, 1975, they got married in Reno, Nevada. Maybe the wedding had been too hopeful for the kind of life they were both looking to have. Janice dropped out of high school at 17, And Hooker said he would follow the path of a builder or a lumberjack, but that was nothing more than a distraction from his real goal in life, which was to capture more women to fulfill all his perversions. So it goes without saying that they didn't live lives full of luxury. They moved in together to a cheap apartment and continued their married life. Behind what their neighbors could see, there was a sadistic couple, or rather, that's what Hooker was after, experimenting day by day with even worse things. There were times when, in the middle of their sessions, Hooker would strangle Janice until she passed out. Not long after they got married, when Janice and Hooker had a fight, he got so angry that he put a knife to her throat and asked her if she wanted to die. On another occasion, he showed her a news article from a newspaper, which he apparently collected, about a gruesome crucifixion, and told her that if he ever killed her, that's how he would do it. It was becoming harder and harder for Janice to ignore the possibility that her husband might kill her. During the first 2 years of their marriage, she tried to go along with her husband's strange fantasies, becoming more and more submissive to his demands. But when Hooker brought out an army gas mask with the eyes and ventilation holes taped over, she resisted. The mask clearly terrified her, and Hooker had to gag her to keep her from screaming when he put it over her head, obviously against her will. Hooker's experiments seemed to be getting more and more violent, stranger. Even though they were afraid to stand up to him and say no, Janice was no longer as interested in taking part. It was just too painful. Maybe Janice's fear made her a less exciting partner, or maybe Hooker was just getting bored with her. Either way, it seems that one person just wasn't enough to satisfy his cravings. In any case, Hooker started talking about a fantasy he had had for a long time. He wanted to bring a third person into the house. Another woman who would submit to his sadomasochistic experiments. A girl who couldn't say no. Basically, he was bringing up the idea of kidnapping a girl, and he wanted Janice to agree to it. Hooker used to read the newspaper a lot, and for a moment he thought he could place an ad and maybe attract someone who wouldn't exactly be forced. Although there were a few problems, which mostly had to do with the cost. It was expensive to publish in the newspaper, especially with details. It could also happen that whoever responded would want money in exchange, so he spent his days thinking about how to finally start carrying out what he wanted. While Hooker was worried about the logistics of finding and keeping another woman, Janice was worried that this third person would be a threat to their marriage. Despite these habits they had, Janice still felt that she loved her husband. She had become so dependent on Hooker that she could hardly imagine being without him. So even though the idea of him focusing the most painful acts, especially the stranglings, on someone else brought her some relief, she insisted that there should be no sexual relations between her husband and this other woman. They were husband and wife, and as she saw it, true intimacy should be reserved only for them. That's where the idea came from that they could only have anal sex, so as not to betray the marriage. It's not exactly clear how or when it happened, but eventually Hooker and Janice reached an agreement. It was a trade-off. He could kidnap someone if she could also have someone. She wanted a baby. By then, they had been together for quite a while and had found a better place to live. It was at 1140 Oak Street. It was a small 2-bedroom house with front and back yards, hardwood floors, a dining room, and a basement. The basement was really small, but it would work for what they needed. Using planks from the diamond sawmill where he worked, Hooker built a wide table that would serve as a platform. He put hooks in each corner so the leather cuffs he had made could be easily fastened whenever he wanted to restrain Janice, added extra hooks to a beam in the ceiling for hanging, and then built the main box. It was a strong, heavy contraption, surprisingly heavy, with large metal hinges and double walls. He had Janice come down to try it out, and sure enough, the neck hole was the right size and closed as it should. Actually, that's what he thought, and I guess what he wanted to happen, but it was a very, very tight hole. Anyway, not everything he did went according to plan. Even though Hooker made a lot of preparations, and his plans were, for the most part, well thought out, finding the right person wasn't so easy. Janice got pregnant and had her baby, a girl, in the fall of 1976. But by then, Hooker still hadn't managed to fulfill his part of the deal. He had all the equipment ready in the car. He had even stalked some women and taken pictures of them, but none of them worked out. Every time he was about to pull it off, something went wrong. But on May 19th, 1977, Cameron Hooker's luck changed. At the end of his shift at Diamond, he got home from work as usual, around 4 o'clock. He picked up his wife and baby, and they went out for a drive. They drove around for about half an hour or so, and then he saw her. Standing on the side of Antelope Boulevard was Colleen Stan. Hooker stopped and offered her a ride. The rest of the story you already know.
I did think I was gonna die. I was terribly claustrophobic. I was having such a hard time breathing. I just cried out to God. Cameron was torturing me one time. He had me hanging up suspended in the basement next to me, and he said, "Go ahead and scream, I'll cut your vocal cords. I've done it before."
I mean, what would you think about in there?
In your mind, you can go anywhere. And I've heard a lot of POWs say that they did the same thing I did. And you just have to go someplace else in your mind. I thought of my family. I went on picnics with my family. I went on holidays with my family.
The first month that Colleen was in the box, in the basement, all they did was give her a plate of food and water. They didn't bathe her or let her brush her teeth. She had also stopped menstruating. She spent her days listening to the patterns around her. For example, every morning she could hear a car leaving. This way, she had started to recognize when it was day and when it was night. Janice would occasionally give her drinks or talk to her from a distance, but to Colleen, she was nothing more than a shadow. It wasn't until 3 months later that Hooker decided it would be a good idea to give the young woman a bath. Of course, he didn't miss the chance to do something perverse. He set up his camera in the bathroom, went to Colleen, tied her hands behind her back, covered the blindfold over her eyes with duct tape, gagged her, and tied her legs to a broomstick. Then he put her face down in the water. Colleen couldn't get up because the broomstick wedged against the edge of the bathtub kept her from lifting her knees underneath her. Hooker pushed her head under until she couldn't hold her breath anymore. When the bubbles stopped and she started to suck in water, he pulled her up by the hair and dunked her again. While he was soaking her, over and over, he took the opportunity to focus his camera, which he had already loaded with film and kept close by, and snap some photos. He dunked her more than 20 times while he kept taking pictures. When she was finally allowed to sit up and catch her breath, she started breathing with a lot of pain. On Hooker's orders, Janice had to fix Colleen's hair, or at least try to. Honestly, 5 months sweating in a box without bathing is a pretty good way to make your hair horribly dirty and tangled. It was tangled, matted, and dirty, and the tape had also left a sticky residue in it. Regular hair conditioner only had a minimal effect, so Janice tried putting vegetable oil on it. She still couldn't comb out the knots, so she gave up and grabbed the scissors. She cut out one knot and then another, until she had finally cut about 5 inches of hair. Months later, in January 1978, things changed when Colleen was taken out of the box and Hooker forced her to sign a contract in which she agreed to be his slave. That contract stated that Colleen's new name would be Kay, or just Kay, and that she could only refer to Hooker as master. She was also forbidden to speak unless spoken to directly. This slave contract was nothing more than something he had seen in one of his magazines. It was more like roleplay than anything real, but he copied it with a rented typewriter and showed it to Colleen as if it were legitimate. He explained to her that the company knew she was there and that she had to sign. This group was supposedly in charge of human trafficking and the sale of slaves, and if she didn't sign, they would take her away. To prevent that from happening, he had to register her. Colleen found the situation strange in many ways, but she clearly wasn't in a position to resist much, so she ended up signing. Not without asking several questions first. After that contract, that's when Hooker began raping Colleen multiple times a day. However, out of respect for his wife, there was never any vaginal penetration. Instead, Hooker raped her anally and orally. It was also that same year when the family moved to a trailer home in Red Bluff, California. And this is the part where Colleen's situation changes directly to what you probably saw in the title. Since there was no basement in this place, she was locked in a coffin under the Hooker's bed for the rest of her years in captivity. They only let her out of that box for a few hours a day to feed her, let her use the bathroom, and, of course, to abuse her. Colleen was even locked in the coffin under the bed while Janice Hooker gave birth to her second child right above her. Colleen endured 7 years of captivity like this, and it wasn't just because of the conditions they kept her in, but also because Hooker had told her they were part of a cult called the Company, which was supposedly keeping track of Colleen's family. That way, Hooker threatened to harm her family and friends if she ever tried to rebel or escape. It was exactly that fear of her family being hurt that made Colleen extremely obedient to everything the Hookers asked of her. Little by little, over time, she managed to gain more freedom and didn't have to spend so many hours in the coffin. There even came a point when Colleen was allowed to walk around the house and the yard. Even though she had multiple chances to escape, her fear for her family's safety kept her from doing it. Colleen was so cooperative with the Hookers that they even let her visit her family in 1981. She visited her parents together with Cameron Hooker, who claimed to be her boyfriend. Both of them tricked Colleen's parents into believing that she had run away of her own free will, but the family thought she was involved in a cult because of her handmade clothes and the way she behaved. To recap, Colleen was being held captive against her will because she believed a cult was following her family. And Colleen's family, for their part, didn't know she was being held captive. Instead, they believed she was the one involved in a cult. By that time, Colleen was already known as part of the family by neighbors and friends, but the Hookers said she was the nanny who lived in the house with them. Sometime before, the couple's second daughter had been born and they needed more help, so in a way, it seemed believable. In any case, the visit to Colleen's parents was too much for Cameron Hooker, who thought she was giving his slave too much freedom. So after that visit, they took away all the freedom she had gained, and she spent 3 years locked up almost 24 hours a day in the coffin. In 1983, Colleen was introduced to the couple's daughters and given certain freedoms again. She even managed to get permission to work at a motel. By then, 7 years later, there was trust between Janice and Colleen. Both of them knew they were very afraid of him and of every idea he came up with. At that point, Hooker had a new plan that increased Janice's anxiety. He called it the alternate night system. No matter how he used the Bible to justify it, to her it seemed sinful and wrong. He told the women that with this new system, he would sleep with one of them for 2 nights, with the other for the next 2 nights, and with whoever he wanted for the remaining 3. He tried to present this as a proposal, as if during their nights they had the option to do whatever they wanted, but both women knew that if they didn't do what Hooker wanted, they would be punished. They were very aware that in reality, there was no other option with him. In an attempt to just end it all, Janice asked Hooker to strangle her to death. She thought that since he had already done it several times, leaving her unconscious, this would be an easy task, but in the end, Hooker strangled her without killing her. After this, Janice had nothing left to lose. If the worst thing that could happen was that Hooker ended up killing her, there wasn't much else to do. So Janice made a decision. Everything came to an end in 1983 when Cameron Hooker wanted Colleen to be his second wife. That was the last straw for Janice. Even though she had been her husband's accomplice, Janice had also been physically, psychologically, and sexually tortured by her husband since the very first time they met. And that's why she went along with Colleen's kidnapping, because that way she didn't have to endure all those tortures herself. It took her months to make up her mind. She spent a long time thinking about whether she should leave, whether she should free Colleen, or if they could leave together, until finally, fed up with her own situation and Colleen's, on Thursday, August 9th, 1984, she arrived at King's Lodge. Around 11:30 in the morning, she went to the motel room where the woman was working at that moment, gathered her courage, and finally told her what she had wanted to confess for so long. She said, "Kay," which was what they called Colleen, "I need to tell you something. Cameron lied to you about everything. The company, the contract, the slavery, everything he told you about me being a slave, all of that was a lie. He lied to scare you so you would keep being a slave." Colleen was horrified that someone could lie so constantly, so convincingly, the way Cameron Hooker had. She cried from shock and disbelief. Janice cried too, saying over and over again how sorry she was. She apologized to her right then for everything she had put her through. They decided to ask Pastor Dabney for advice since he was someone they both knew, because they still didn't really know what to do. Janice called the pastor and scheduled an appointment for the afternoon, then left. Colleen went back to her tasks of making beds and cleaning the bathrooms, since she had quit right then and there, but her boss asked her to at least finish that day's work. About 2 hours later, Janice came back to pick up Colleen, who said goodbye and asked Mrs. Moran, her manager, to please hold her next paycheck until she could send a new address, since all the money she made from this job was going to Hooker, and she didn't want that to happen anymore. When they got to the church, the pastor had a hard time understanding them because they were really upset. but he learned that Colleen had been held against her will, that both of them had been subjected to strange sexual practices, and that they were both terrified of Hooker. Dabney advised them to pack their bags and leave that house immediately. He suggested that they go to their homes and stay with their parents, but it wasn't that simple. It was getting close to 4 o'clock, Hooker's quitting time, Janice explained, and she was supposed to pick him up from work as usual. There wasn't enough time to gather their things before then, and they were afraid to confront him. The pastor then told them to pick him up. The pastor told them to act like everything was normal, to pick him up from work as usual, pretend nothing had happened, and then leave the next day after Hooker had gone to work. And that's what they decided to do. It occurred to Colleen in the middle of it all that Janice's resolve might falter and she might confess to her husband what she had done, but at that point there was nothing left to do but trust. They picked up Hooker as usual, made dinner, ate, and got ready for bed after cleaning up. Just the usual, everyday routine. That night, Janice slept on the floor with Colleen, saying she didn't want to sleep with Hooker because she felt bad. The next morning, Hooker left for work at 5 a.m. And as soon as he walked out the door, Janice and Colleen started packing. When Kathy and Dawn, the couple's daughters, woke up, they sent them off to Sunday school. And with that out of the way, the two women quickly finished the job. By noon, they were done. They gathered their things, picked up the girls, and fled the house to Janice's parents' place in the nearby town of Gerber. Once they were there, they talked about staying together, about trying to build a good home for the girls. They tried to make plans, and Janice really wanted Colin to stay with her and her daughters. She was, as you'll see, a very dependent person. But Colin knew she was free now, and her mind told her she had to take advantage of it and get as far away as possible. So she decided to call her father, who of course was surprised that his daughter, who hadn't spoken to him in years, suddenly called him. She didn't explain much, just told him she wanted to come back. And she asked him for $100 for the bus. He, excited, asked if she didn't want more money, but she said that would be enough. The next morning, after Colleen had her ticket in hand and was sure she would get on the bus to go home at that moment, she called Cameron Hooker. That was her declaration of independence. She told him, "I just wanted to let you know that I'm leaving, that I know you lied about everything, and that you can't keep me here anymore." Colleen doesn't remember everything the man said, but what she does remember is that Hooker cried. Unfortunately for Janice, things weren't that easy. She didn't tell her family much, so they thought she was exaggerating and that it was just a couple's fight, so they encouraged her to go back home. And she did. But when she got back, she realized she really didn't want to be there. For his part, Hooker, apparently remorseful, had promised to change, had started going to church with his wife, and even said he wanted to go to church if necessary, which clearly was the case. But none of this could fully convince Janice. By the way, for a while, they also kept in touch with Colleen at Janice's request, since supposedly Hooker was remorseful, but she didn't really care much and never actually came back. It was Janice herself who finally reported Hooker to the police 3 months after Colleen escaped. It's believed that she had wanted to leave for a very long time. When Hooker started talking about wanting more sex slaves, she already had one foot out the door. But fear in her daughters made her stay. Actually, given everything I've told you, it's no surprise that Janice was the one who ended up exposing what was happening. And if it hadn't been for that, maybe Colleen would have never seen freedom. She had felt a lot of guilt from the very beginning. At one point, she even had to leave the house and escape to her sister's place for a while because she couldn't bear the weight of what was happening with her husband anymore. While she didn't like seeing Colleen being tortured, she also didn't like being the center of that twisted tension herself. But on top of that, she felt very jealous. She didn't want her husband to pay attention to anyone else. This was part of her abandonment issues. These were things she had to overcome in order to finally reveal the crime. Also, by that time, Janice had 2 daughters to take care of. Everything became a risk for her future, and she simply couldn't go on like that anymore. After some back and forth, in a moment of absolute fear and anger, Janice went to the pastor, told him everything, and he called the police. In fact, at first the sheriff told her that basically she was also implicated and would be prosecuted as a hooker. But the next day, they informed her that she had been granted immunity and could go to the station to tell her whole story. And that's what she did. Of course, what she said shocked the sheriff and surprised everyone who later found out what had happened during all those years. It was 7 years of torture, but she also revealed something else.
Janice not only reported Colleen's kidnapping, but she also confessed that a year earlier, in January 1976, her husband had also kidnapped another girl, Marie Elizabeth Spanhake, whom he tortured just like Colleen. but with the difference that afterward, he killed her.
He kept this picture of her in this space in between the pedestal of the bed and the actual box that he kept me in under his waterbed. And he had my purse in there and my personal things, I guess, in it. And then he had this picture of this woman. So every time I got in and out of the box, I saw this picture of this woman.
The body of this young woman was never found, so no charges were filed in that case. But Hooker was indeed brought to trial for Colleen's kidnapping, and in 1985, he was sentenced to 104 years in prison. Currently, Cameron Hooker remains in prison for his crime. For her part, Colleen went on with her life. Today, she is part of an organization that helps abused women and has dedicated herself to helping women like her. Her story has been told in her autobiography and also in multiple documentaries, as well as being referenced in popular culture.
In fact, the tortures that Hooker subjected Colleen to came from a French erotic book called The Story of O, which was his inspiration. The only difference is that the protagonist of the book engaged in all those sexual acts consensually. Currently, both Colleen and Janice live in California, but they have no contact with each other.
And now that so many years have passed, it's kind of like it was a whole nother lifetime, you know? And this is my new life.
And that's all for today. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this case and what other cases you'd like me to cover on the channel. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those platforms. And with nothing more to say, here's a new video, here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.